Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome to this Peak Prosperity Podcast. I am your host, Chris Martenson. Now, in the Crash Course, we discuss many things, and everything is important to some degree. Water, however, is among the most important topics in substances there is. As our next guest says, you can find substitutes for oil and coal if you want to, but there is no substitute for water. So it's time we shined a brighter light on this important topic, and that's what we're going to do today. So joining us is Sandra Postel, a world-renowned water expert who I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with in the past as a post-carbon fellow back in 2009, I think that might have been. Sandra's worked on water issues for 30 years, and in her flagship book, the award-winning Last Oasis, she really dove in and did a great job talking about many of the things that we are experiencing today. She also directs the independent Global Water Policy Project and lectures, writes, consults on global water issues. And she's a former National Geographic Fellow. She's co-creator of Change the Course, the National Freshwater Conservation and Restoration Initiative pioneered by National Geographic and its partners, which has restored billions of gallons of water to depleted rivers and wetlands. She's written some 20 op-ed features. They've appeared in more than 30 newspapers, all the big ones you've heard of, and is a frequent speaker and lecturer. You might have seen her on BBC's Planet Earth series, Leonardo DiCaprio's 11th Hour, or National Geographic's Breakthrough series. Sandra, welcome.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, thanks. We have a lot of people who are very interested in water on our website and among our listenership. So before we dive into that, tell us about your career. Where and how did you start, and what do you spend most of your time working on today?
Well, I've been working on water for a long time. I was one of those young people, ever since I was a teenager, that really knew I wanted to do something on behalf of the earth. The water piece, came into focus for me a bit later. After I graduated, actually got my graduate degree at Duke, and my first job was out in California, which had just come off of a multi-year drought, not unlike the one that they're going through now. And I got, put on the water projects and just got very engaged with water, the importance of water conservation, how water is needed not only for humans but for nature. And then I joined the World Watch Institute. Again, I was still in my 20s, so still really kind of developing and learning my ideas about water, but had a chance to really look at the global landscape around water at the World Watch Institute, and wrote my first papers and books there, and really sort of dug deep into these issues, and particularly how water is not always where we need it, when we need it, and what does that mean for food security, for our economies, and, of course, for the health of the natural environment that we depend on for so many things, as well as social and political stability. Water is sort of a lens, in a way, through which I look at the world. And it's a fascinating way to look at the world, because many things that we don't associate with water really have water, as an underpinning. And so I've just had a great time over 30 years learning more about how water shapes our world and how important it's going to be to figure out how to secure water for people, for our economies, and for nature going forward, particularly with climate change. Now, such an important part of that picture.
Now, it's certainly true that water has the opportunity to replenish itself. It comes out of the sky, thankfully, like it does here in New England, more often than where you currently reside at this point. But when we're talking water, we're really talking fresh water. So let's start at the top for our listeners. Really, fresh water, I was always coached, even in grade school, that if to save water meant turning the tap off in between, while I was brushing my teeth and rinsing. That's certainly important. But really, who are the big users of water in our world today?
Well, first, you raise a very important fundamental point that water is renewable, thanks to the water cycle, which we all learned about in probably 5th or 6th grade, but it is also finite, so it's only available in a finite amount. And if we go beyond that amount, we're in an unsustainable situation. And so when we look at our water use, Yes, it's good, I think, for consciousness raising to turn off the tap when we brush our teeth. But really the big users of water are farmers, because growing crops is a very water-intensive enterprise. Even if it's done efficiently, it is a water-intensive enterprise. Crops just have to transpire a lot of water to cool themselves down and to grow. It's a fundamental process for plant growth. And so that water is transpired back to the atmosphere, and you can't capture that and reuse it. It may condense and fall again as rain, but if we look at the areas of the world that are now experiencing water depletion of rivers, depletion of groundwater, they're usually areas that have a lot of irrigated agriculture going on, because it takes so much water to grow our food, to produce our cotton, for example. It can take more than 600 gallons of water just to make a simple cotton shirt. That's as much water as you probably use at home in a week just to make one cotton shirt. So our lifestyles take a lot of water, but again, diet and things that require growing plants in the field really are the big water consumers for most of us.
And what about thermoelectric power plants? I know they draw a lot of water. Are they actually using that?
Yes, thermoelectric power is a very big user of water. And again, not to get too technical here, but it's important to distinguish between water that's consumed and water that's used, because we tend to use them interchangeably, those phrases, but in fact, from a hydrologic standpoint, there's an important difference. The plant that's transpiring water is consuming water, because you can't take that water and recycle it and use it again right away. It's not in our control anymore. Whereas water that's taken out of a river to cool a power plant, coal plant, or a nuclear plant, is run through the plant, cools it down, and then usually is put back in the same river as it was drawn from, with very little water lost in the process. A small amount is lost in the process. Now, that's for most of those systems. There are some that use a different system that take less water out, but recycle and reuse it and consume it. But as a consequence, we don't think of thermoelectric power as consuming a lot of water, but it is, in the United States, the biggest user of water. And so more water is withdrawn from rivers and lakes to cool power plants, thermoelectric power plants, than any other use. And so even though it's not a consumption of water, it's a big user of water. And it also, if we look at a plant like Indian Point north of New York, for example, something like 1 billion fish, get entrained in that cooling intake and are killed in the process of cooling that power plant. So it's not without a footprint, in a sense. It's not without an important impact. It's just not a consumptive use of water like agriculture is.
Right. So when we hear about China tossing up a coal-fired plant a week, that's not really going to impact their overall need for water all that much. I mean, certainly some evaporates if they've got cooling towers, but not a lot.
Yeah, and again, it depends on the type of power plant, whether it's a recirculating kind or what we call a once-through kind. The once-through kind, you take it out, you put it back. The evaporative cooling or recirculating cooling, you tend to take a little bit less, but then you lose more to consumption as a result. So it kind of depends where you are. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So you recently said then that if an alarm bell was needed to focus global attention on water security, it has rung. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was writing about the fact that for the last 2 years, the World Economic Forum, which meets every year in Davos, Switzerland, and does, as a sort of a prelude to that meeting, they do an assessment of water risk and what are the big drivers and factors contributing to risk to our global economy and to society at large. And for the last 2 years, they have different categories of this, and for the last 2 years, water crises made the top of one of those lists. This year, they ranked water crises as the top global risk for the next decade. And, of course, right behind that were things that relate to water. Our failure to adequately mitigate and prepare for climate change, extreme weather, food crises. So water, in a sense, is at the heart of a lot of these risks, but is even topping itself some of those global threats.
And the point of an economic forum like Davos to raise water, why are they doing that? What is that? How do they use that in their proceedings?
Well, the World Economic Forum includes among its members, heads of state, chief executive officers of big companies, civic leaders. So it's a diverse group of world leaders in a sense that are concerned with human well-being, are concerned with social stability and progress, and of course also risks to business. And so this assessment is really to shine a light on some of those underlying risks that society might be facing, and that maybe isn't adequately dealing with. So last year when water topped the list, right behind it was weapons of mass destruction and the spread of infectious diseases. Mm-hmm. So it's really kind of looking systemically at these problems and asking, well, which ones are likely to, cause society, the most risk over whatever time frame they're looking at. So I think water coming to the top of this was fairly new. Water's been in the rankings here and there over the last 15 years or so, but to rise to the top of two of these rankings 2 years in a row suggests that the business world is taking notice of this, that water is so fundamental, not only to business, but to social stability, which of course affects business. And so, the business world is very much taking notice, which I think is new, not brand new, but when I first started working on water issues, it really didn't have that kind of attention. But it does now, and I think for very good reason.
Well, now, was there any particular incident or set of incidents that caused water to float to the top of that concern list this year?
Well, I think I think it's the number of areas that are experiencing water problems. And of course the continued problem from a human perspective that more than 800 million people still lack safe drinking water. Something that everybody listening to this podcast takes for granted every day, that we can turn on a tap and have water that's safe and clean to drink. And so the fact that more than 800 million people don't have this is still a major problem, major source of disease, particularly among kids under 5 years old. So this is still a big development challenge that we have yet to meet. We've been making progress, but it's still not there. And then, of course, the competition for water that arises when you have increasing scarcity, competition, between cities and farms within an area, competition between states and provinces within the same country, and then, of course, competition and tensions between countries that share rivers. And so, these are fundamental concerns, I think, going forward. And we still have, rising population, rising economic growth, rising water demand against this finite supply. And so just, navigating that tricky course going ahead is the challenge.
Now, I've heard it said that sometimes when a country imports wheat, for example, they're really importing water. A lot of water goes into growing wheat, and so I'm wondering, when I was reading, Sandra, like these UN projections that say, oh my gosh, by 2050, here's how much more food we're going to have to grow. And of course, I talked to the soil scientists, and they're like, oh yeah, but this is on increasingly degraded lands. I'm wondering, when they're putting together those gigantic food forecasts, which of course, it's a forecast, could go either way, but when they're putting that together, are they talking to someone on your side of the fence about water?
Well, hopefully they are. I've written a lot about water and agriculture, and hopefully that's been factored into some of these assessments. I'm sure at this point it is, because water again has risen on into the sphere of concern in a way that it just wasn't 20 years ago. But we need good soil, we need good water, and you need good seeds to grow crops, and you need sunshine. So making sure those basic ingredients are available is a key thing. For me, the silver lining in the water picture is that we haven't really begun to tap the potential to use water more productively. Water has been heavily, heavily subsidized, particularly in agriculture. And so there's been little incentive for farmers, to invest in the more efficient irrigation technologies, to grow crops that are more, appropriate to the climate. Resetting the signals and getting those signals more aligned with reality, I think could move us, toward a more productive agricultural sector with regard to water in a major way. We just have not begun to tap that yet. And so the silver lining is that we have so much we can do that we've barely begun to do.
Well, let's talk about some of that then. I'm very interested in this side. What are some of the things we can do besides, I don't know, stop trying to grow stuff in deserts, which seems like probably a bad idea, particularly for Saudi Arabia using an ancient aquifer to do that. But assuming we've that's not the low-hanging fruit you're talking about, what are the sort of practices that we could put in place and or technologies that are sitting there but are not maybe yet widely adopted?
Well, there are a bunch of them, and the key thing is to make productive use of water. If you think about flooding, a field, only a portion of that water is actually getting to the roots of a plant that is going to use that water to grow. The rest of it is either going to, run through the soil, maybe recharge the aquifer below, maybe run off the field and join, a river downstream, maybe evaporate back to the atmosphere off the soil, doing no good, really, for anything. And so getting more productive with that water would mean delivering it more efficiently to the roots of the plant. So one technology that's able to do that is drip irrigation, where you deliver just the volume of water the plant needs. You deliver it to the roots of the plant, either on the soil, below the soil, and then the plant transpires that water, so you're reducing evaporative losses that aren't serving any purpose, and you're channeling that water to the roots where it can transpire and help the plant grow. And so that's a beneficial use of the water that's consumed. And so more of that can mean, well, we can take less water out of that river if we can grow the plants using less water. So that allows us, if we choose, to leave more water in a river. So some of the projects that Might Change the Course program has been working on involve that kind of activity. Let's put in drip irrigation, which allows us to grow those same crops with less water, leaving more for the river. And so as we try to balance human water uses with the needs for nature to have water, that's a great technology. And again, it has to be accompanied by policies that say, yes, we do want to leave more water in the river. How can we do that and still keep agriculture productive? And that's one great way to do it.
Now,
just to finish one more point, I think one of the big frontiers now in agriculture, particularly irrigated agriculture, is going to be, marrying information technology with efficiency technology. We've seen this in our cars. There's sensors. We can have sensors in soils that let us know, how much water is in that soil. When does that crop need another irrigation, and how much water does it need? So, and then deliver that water very efficiently. So if if you can marry real-time weather monitoring with efficient technologies to deliver the water and know exactly when the crop needs irrigation water and how much it needs, well, that can save a lot of water.
Now, what I was going to say back there is, I totally agree, because I have a pretty big veggie garden, and I've got drip irrigation in it, which I put in, I guess, 4 years ago now, and I've been gardening 30 years. I wish I'd put it in 30 years prior. It's the most amazing technology as far as I'm concerned, because of how it delivers the water and how it moisture gets into the soil, and how it really does. It's literally a superior way. The only thing that could improve on it would be Mother Nature, giving us a nice long slow drizzle. But otherwise, it's just wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
So let me talk. We mentioned before, though, there was, that water is fundamentally replaceable, but in some respects, it kind of isn't a renewable resource, as you know. So I want to just talk quickly about aquifers and glaciers as well, I guess, although maybe they can recharge themselves under right circumstances. But the aquifers that I wrote about a number of years ago in the crash course, many of them seem to recharge really slowly. And I guess that really came into the fore in California, in the United States, at least for the U.S. audience, with the subsidence of the land there and the drawing down of those water tables. I thought that really shone a pretty bright spotlight on things. Do you think is that really, is this monster El Niño going to help, get us out of that trouble? But B, even if it does, do you think did people's attitudes change as a consequence of that last drought?
Well, the drought continues, of course, in California. They're definitely not out of the woods yet. And groundwater is such an important water asset, if you will, to consider. I mean, it's literally an out of sight, out of mind, problem in a way. And we have been over-pumping groundwater in so many parts of the world that, if you work numbers, the estimates would be that something like 10% of our food supply today depends on the overpumping of groundwater, which is kind of like a bubble in the food economy, that we're propping up our food supply with this unsustainable use of water. It's a debt. It's a water debt, to be overpumping an aquifer. And we're doing that in the North China Plain in China, in Northwest India, the breadbasket of India, in California, in the high plains of the United States, and other parts of the world. And so it's a serious problem, and gets worse in times of drought, as you point out, Chris, that we've just seen in California, where when the surface supplies dry up, when the reservoirs shrink, the rivers don't flow as much, farmers have their allocations of water cut. Well, what do? They sink deeper wells and they pump up more groundwater. We've seen this in Texas during droughts. We're seeing it in California. And so the depletion rates of groundwater have increased significantly, not only in California, but also in the whole Colorado River Basin, which has been in drought for the last 14 years. This year is looking better. But there's been a tremendous amount of groundwater depletion both in California and the Colorado River Basin. And so, you can literally see a reservoir shrink before your eyes. We've seen the famous bathtub ring around Lake Mead in the Colorado. It's down, down, down. We don't see it happening when it happens underground, but it's just as important, and in some cases more serious, because we tend to look to groundwater exactly during those times of drought. And if we don't replenish that groundwater, it's not there when we need it. And it has to be replenished. And typically you have this balance of drawing it down in dry years, replenishing it during wet years, but there's been so much more depletion occurring, and depletion even in normal years, so-called normal years, that we're losing that important reserve of water in some of the most important food-producing regions.
Now, if in many respects, this feels like a population story, of course, because more people are going to use more water for personal, residential uses. Also, they're going to eat more food, all of that. To what extent would you say that this is actually a population issue, or versus how much can we pin on just, let's say, substandard practices that definitely could be improved?
Well, it's population, it's consumption, and it's technology, and it's the failure of policy to, really move us toward a more, water efficient set of practices in agriculture. So it's really all of those things. The fact that we're growing, with water in California, water in the Colorado River Basin, where water is fairly, precious. We're growing some very low-value crops, and using a lot of water to do that, and often doing it inefficiently. A lot of water is used to grow hay and alfalfa. Some of it, a good portion of it, is actually, used to grow alfalfa, which is then shipped to countries like China to support their dairy industry. So in a sense, we're exporting Colorado River water to China in the form of alfalfa so that they can support their dairy industry and have the alfalfa grown here. And again, it's not because farmers are unpatriotic or bad people or anything like that. They're responding to incentives, right? And so it's very important with water that we begin to create other opportunities for water. If farmers could make as much income by selling water to an urban area or selling water to a conservation organization or a water trust in order to put that water back to depleted ecosystems, they would do that, right? It's an economic decision. And so it's up to policy and our public officials that are overseeing our water supplies to make the laws and practices work for the benefit of a sustainable water future. And right now we're just not doing that. The subsidies are great, and the water laws essentially are grounded in something called, prior appropriation and beneficial use, which means use it or lose it. So if you have a water right, you basically need to show that you're using it, or you could risk losing it. And so there's a disincentive, actually, to use water efficiently in much of the West. State laws are beginning to change that and open it up. We're beginning to see the idea of marketing water a bit more, but there's still a long way to go with that. And so we have some sort of really crazy practices around water, particularly in the West.
Now, this raises an interesting intersection here because I love what you said. People do respond to incentives, and I don't think it's wrong or inappropriate for people to respond to incentives. If you don't like how people are responding, you need different incentives is usually the answer. But speaking about that, I know there's been a lot of moves to privatize water. Thinking back to some of the heavy-duty money crowd at Davos, some of them must have been rubbing their hands thinking about how to monetize water and sell it back to everybody. But let me also say, certainly water projects, they're not free. Are you at all concerned about the move of corporations and other privatization efforts in water, or could that be a good thing because it'll help align incentives properly?
I am not in favor of privatization of water, and that's because water is so much more than a commodity. It is the basis of life. It is needed, by every living thing on the earth, and so you don't want to privatize that. To me, it's the government's job as custodian of the public trust in water. There's a public trust in water, and the government is really the custodian of that public trust. I think it's fine to have governments contract with private companies, of course, to check for the leaks in the system, to install the drip irrigation systems. Private sector has a lot to bring to water management. But the ownership and the oversight of water, I believe, needs to remain to an entity that is accountable to the general public, not to shareholders. And again, it's because of water's importance. It is essential to life. So it's very different from any other commodity we can think of for that reason. I believe it needs to remain under the umbrella of a public entity that's accountable to the general public, so governments in particular. Again, that's not to say that there's not a role for the private sector. There absolutely is in many, many ways. But again, that accountability question is key.
I agree. I totally agree. Now, you mentioned this idea of growing alfalfa in one hemisphere and shipping it all the way to the other to support cows, for instance, and milk and dairy production. And I've heard the same thing about Saudi Arabia buying certain parts of land specifically to grow hay, ship it back for their uses in Saudi Arabia. And I know Saudi Arabia has an enormous desalination set of projects undergoing at this point. That they've obviously got clear water issues going on there. When you look at desalination, is this like an interesting addition to the water story? Could it really be a cure in the case of a super dedicated country like Saudi Arabia, or is it a pipe dream?
Well, in a country like Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf countries in general, it's a lifeline. Saudi Arabia completely overtapped its aquifers in a really kind of crazy situation back in the 70s and 80s. The Saudis decided it would be important for them to become self-sufficient in food production. This is when we had, oil embargoes going on. So, they had that in mind, that there could be a food embargo against them at some point. Better to become self-sufficient in grain. So they basically started, tapping all their deep aquifers to grow wheat in the desert. And they not only became self-sufficient in wheat, they were actually exporting wheat from Saudi Arabia. Well, they completely depleted their groundwater supplies in doing this, and really had to end that whole program. And of course, drinking water, they have no rivers there, so they were building desalination plants, and the groundwater was mostly used for irrigation of that wheat. But they built desalination plants to provide for their drinking water. So in countries like the Persian Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, I think desalination definitely has a place. There's no rain there, so people living there need to have drinking water, and desalination can make sense. About half of the desalination around the world now is in those Persian Gulf countries. But and island nations are in the same category. They don't have rivers necessarily, so they need to have some way to get water. So there's a place for desalination. But what I see now is that there's this move toward, every time there's drought, when there's water shortages predicted, cities are beginning to think desalination is the way to go. And to me, it is not an elegant solution at all. It's expensive, it's very energy intensive, and it continues the idea that whenever we run short, we should just go out and find a new supply, rather than ask the question, how can we get more efficient with the supply we already have? And conservation, almost universally in these cases, is going to be the least costly, most environmentally sound way of meeting new water needs. But it's not thought of that way. And so we've seen a lot of cities reduce their water use through effective conservation over the last 10, 20, 30 years. So it's proven that this can be done. I mean, right near you, Boston has a great example where the water use in Boston today is back where it was 50 years ago, even though the economy has done very well during that time frame. They've completely avoided the need to build a diversion from the Connecticut River to supply Boston with more water, because conservation was cheaper and it was effective, and they no longer even need to think about that diversion. And so conservation was the way to go, and it cost about half as much as that diversion would have cost. But it took a change in mentality. It took a change in mindset to think about conservation as a new source of supply, just like desalination would be a new source of supply. And so I think that's the key. And again, if you look at the proposals to build desalination plants after the 10-year drought in Australia, what they call their Big Dry, all 5 major cities in Australia, Adelaide, Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, Perth, they all built desalination plants. Most of them had never been used, and yet they're there. You have to be paid off. I mean, they're big capital projects. And so, again, it's that mindset. Let's think about how we can use the water we already have more efficiently, more productively, rather than go toward this solution that, again, if you're using coal and oil, a fossil fuel to run that desalination plant, you're contributing to climate change, which is going to increase your risk of drought. It's not a good solution. You're building this desal plant to guard against drought, but in the process of running it, you're increasing the likelihood of more drought. So not an elegant solution, in my mind, to that problem.
Well, now let's talk about the climate change aspect of this, and I'm particularly interested in what appears to this layman's eye. The glaciers of the world are retreating in most places that I've looked at, and a lot of places actually really heavily depend on those glaciers. I guess the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas being a gigantic example, but maybe lesser ones in certain places in South America too. As you look around the world with the glaciers, are there any bright red flashing warning signs? Or are we kind of at a yellow or worried stage? Where are we with respect to that part of the story?
Well, in terms of glaciers in particular, I'm very serious concerns because, something like 2 billion people in the world depend on river flows that originate from glaciers, again, mostly in that Himalayan Tibetan Plateau area. The Yellow River, the Yangtze River, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, they all come out of those glaciated areas in the Himalaya Tibetan Plateau. And so for a time, as the glaciers melt, there would likely be more water in those rivers, increasing flood risks to some extent. But then those rivers will diminish over time as the glaciers that feed them had shrunk. And so it's a very serious concern for those regions. And again, a couple billion people and lots of irrigated agriculture that depend on those rivers. You raise an important point about climate change and water, which is that if you think about climate change and how we're going to experience climate change, most of it will be through the water cycle and through changes in the water cycle. And we're seeing signs of this already. What's happening is as climate warms, as the atmosphere warms, it expands. This is just basic physics. It expands, and so it can hold more moisture. And so what that means is that wet areas are likely to get wetter. There'll be more intense rainstorms, more intense precipitation episodes in those areas, and dry areas will get drier. Both precipitation and evaporation rates will change as a result of that atmosphere able to hold more moisture. And so we're starting to see that already. That how many times in the last couple of years have we heard, there's been another 100-year flood, and it's been the second one in 10 years or something. We're starting to see these extreme events occur more often. And it's because the water cycle, in a sense, is speeding up. And that's going to have profound implications for people everywhere, whether you're living in a wet area or an arid area. It's going to change the way water cycles through the land and the way water cycles through the atmosphere. South Carolina this past year saw floods they couldn't believe. And more places, it almost seemed like 2015, even before it was out, it was just being considered the year of wild and crazy weather. And so getting ready for that and preparing for that is so important. This is likely what we're going to see are these weather extremes more and more, and preparing for that. So one of the things I'm starting to work on now is this idea of how do we think about natural systems to help us add resilience in this time of climate change. In other words, if we're going to have to prepare for more flooding and more drought, well, how do we repair the water cycle? How do we make use of natural systems, whether it's floodplains, groundwater aquifers, river systems, wetlands, to help us become more resilient to these changes? And I think there's a lot of potential there to do that. We're just coming off of this age of water engineering. The big dams, the big canals, the big dikes, to control floods, the big diversion systems to move water around. It's been a very engineering-intensive century. But we've really not looked at nature's work in the way that we could. The fact that nature is cleaning water whenever it runs through a wetland, it's absorbing and storing water whenever we allow a river to connect to its floodplain. It recharges groundwater, which we can then tap during times of drought. We've really been substituting civil engineering for ecological engineering, nature's engineering. And in some sense, we have to rebalance that. Because I think it's nature's piece of it that's going to give us the resilience we're going to need to deal with climate impacts.
I completely agree. I love this line of thinking in the language because I use the word resilience a lot, and unfortunately, resilience isn't the same thing as cost effective or efficient or super engineering. Look, we move the water really efficiently from A to B. 30 years ago, I was on this traveling school program called Audubon Expedition Institute, and we used to go hang out in the Everglades. And of course, they would just tour us around these canals. They made a lot of sense. Look, there's these canals, very easy to cut, but it changed the hydrology of the entire region, which they're still struggling with. So it looked like a good idea, but moving water quickly and efficiently is not the same thing as resiliently. And so what you're saying is that when the water cycle is impacted by these big events that happen, whether it's too little water or too much water falling, we need that capability of either, in the case of too little water, having extra reserves on hand, and in the case of too much falling, we need to have those buffers that can absorb it and manage it in the ways that it could be, or we'll just keep experiencing 1,000-year floods with 1,000-year losses.
Right, and all of that natural infrastructure, wetlands, floodplains, healthy watersheds, all of that runs on free solar energy. Whereas all of the man-made alternatives, the treatment plants, the levees, the canals, all of that takes energy to run and maintain. Nature's work is done with free solar energy. So, it's a win-win in a lot of ways. So I think beginning to rethink our relationship to that water cycle and how we live, with a healthier water cycle, I think is going to be really important to us.
Well, now your front lines on this, and last question, I'm really excited to hear your answer on this. First of all, what's the hardest part about changing people's perceptions about and policies towards water use? Part A. Part B, and how do you go about changing perceptions and beliefs and things like that?
Oh, it's a really good question, Chris. I think we're so lucky and we're so privileged to be able to not think about water in most of the aspects of our lives. We literally turn on a tap and there it is. And that hats off to the water engineers and the treatment plant operators and everyone behind the scenes who makes that possible every minute of every day. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, really, when you think about it. And yet water is so much more. It is necessary to grow our food, to make our clothes. Where do we go when we want to rejuvenate ourselves, to have some vacation time? We go to water, whether it's the ocean or a lake or a river, we go to water because it's rejuvenating. So the natural piece is so important too. So we connect in these ways, but we don't really consciously think about how our everyday lives are impacting the water out there. And so I think in some ways it's connecting people, and that's where our Change the Course initiative really is about. It's engaging people in understanding not only how water works, but how their everyday lifestyle requires so much more water than we would think. If you're an average American, holding up your lifestyle takes about 2,000 gallons of water a day. Only 5 or 10% of that is your home water use. The rest is your diet, your energy, your purchase of, cars and clothes and computers and books and everything else. And so it's a lot of water, and we don't think about it that way. And once we realize how much more our water footprint is than just, turning on the tap to brush our teeth, well, that's a good thing because it allows us to be involved in making some better choices. Do we really need 30 T-shirts in our closet? Probably not. Do we really, so saving energy saves water. Every time we recycle, we're saving water. Every time we choose to have, something other than a water-intensive food item, like the classic, hamburger or whatever, we're saving water. So it gives us a lot more choices to be part of the solution. And then the idea that we can, if we get serious about it, we can return water to nature. It's not necessarily a one-way trip. That if we can, as a society, decide we want water to be flowing in our rivers. We don't want to see a dry Colorado or a dry Rio Grande or a dry anything. We want water to be where it's supposed to be. And we can make a choice as a society to do that. And so what we're trying to do in Change the Course is involve everyone in those. We're trying to build a movement, really, of water stewardship that says, we all are part of this challenge together, whether we're an individual, a business, or a conservation organization that can help us get that water back. And so we're trying to educate, engage, and get restore water back to natural systems. And we've returned at this point about 5 billion gallons. And while it's just a drop in the bucket, it's been an important contribution to those wetlands, rivers, deltas that have gotten that extra water. It's made a difference.
Well, thank you so much for doing that and bringing and leading those efforts. I know on my side, working with even just simple economic terms, people do have a little difficulty with the long term. Just look at maybe the municipal pension plans in a variety of cities we could point to. It's mystifying. So when times are good, people forget about it. And when times are bad, they sort of freeze up and then forget about the bad times as soon as the good times come back. So it's a real change effort to get people to say, look, we're not here just to conserve some water so that in 10 minutes somebody can forget that was conserved water and say, hey, look at all this water we can use. It's instead finding a balance between ourselves and the world around us, so that that balance includes not just humans, but of course all life that needs that, and healthy ecosystems. Because my work is never about just how do we use every last scrap and morsel for human purposes. That doesn't fit my view. I don't believe it fits yours. So that's a real change effort to get people to start thinking more. How would I put this? In a sort of a stewardship rather than an extractive mode of thinking.
Yeah, and we have at this point close to 170,000 people who have, in a sense, pledged to do something to conserve water in their daily life. That's really all you need to do to join Change the Course, right? Is make a pledge to do something in your life to shrink your personal water footprint. And our promise is for everyone who makes that pledge, we will return 1,000 gallons of water to a depleted ecosystem. And so we have a community of 170,000 people who have done that and who we communicate with to stay engaged with around freshwater issues. So we are slowly building that movement. Nearly a couple dozen, at this point, 2 dozen businesses that have signed on with us. Again, to try to rebalance that water for nature, water for people, water for nature picture. So we're building this movement slowly but surely, and to me it's very inspiring because again we all use water and we all can be part of stewarding it in a wiser way.
Well, I love it. So for people listening, how can they be the 170,000th and first person to sign up?
Yeah, thank you. A couple of ways. One is to go to changethecourse.us, changethecourse.us. Another is to text river, the word river, to 77177, which will, allow you to make that pledge and join Change the Course in that way. So either the website or just texting river to 77177.
Well, fantastic. And Sandra, is there any other way that people can follow you and your important work?
I, of course, have a website. I need to get more engaged in social media, which I'm going to be doing. I'm starting to work on a book, and so I need to, stop doing so much research and get a little more engaged in social media work. But most of my work is with Change the Course, and we have a very active, social media program as part of the initiative. So I'm present there, just not quite as visible as I should be as Sandra Postel. So.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your time today. And I certainly hope we can re-engage on this at some point. And we're going to send a bunch of people over to Change the Course. So please keep up the great work. And it's been wonderful talking with you.
Likewise, Chris. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed it.